They said the town had closed its doors to her. San Jacinto Viejo moved around her like a field of dry grass. Hands lifted to part, voices lowered, children tugged away. The road to La Cumbre del Encino ate the last light, and Amalia Ríos walked into the hush with a small satchel and a spine that had learned to hold itself straight as a fence post. Dust rose in soft spirals with each step, catching the dying sun and making a halo of ordinary grit around her. The air smelled of oak and sweat. Somewhere behind the hills a dog barked. Her footprints were already fading when the gate swung behind her. The ranch had been a rumor in the town for years, an outcrop of cedar and stone, a house with a porch that faced the highest ridge, and a name that seemed designed to keep secrets. To Amalia, it promised a wage and a place to lay a bag without guards or questions. Eusebio Carranza saw her from the porch before anyone spoke her name. He had been standing there for a long time, as if wind and weather had molded him into that particular impatience. Shoulders that remembered the weight of yokes, hands that never forgot the feel of rope. The first thing you noticed about him was the way the mountains settled into him, as if he belonged more to the stone than to any road. He watched the woman with the careful look of a man who had learned to read small truths. How a person carried silence, how a pair of hands could hide a whole language. When she reached the steps, he said simply, "You're late." His voice was not unkind. It did not have the practiced cruelty of gossip. It had the bluntness of a man who considered words tools and knew which ones to keep in the shed. "I walked," she answered. The words came flat as the evening. Her mouth was small. Her eyes had the muted color of someone who had learned not to let light in all the way. He offered her a place to put her things before he asked why she had come. The porch creaked under new weight. The house smelled of dry wood and something that had once been sweet. Perhaps a woman's soap left behind, long worn thin. Eusebio kept his gaze on her hands. They were steady. They were used to work. "You'll work," he said, naming the transaction like a finished knot. "We have fences and gates. You cook, you mend. You don't ask for more than what's fair." Amalia nodded. She had learned to accept the scratch of reality when it arrived. She answered the terms without pleading. "I won't be a trouble," she said, because she had been told, by strangers, by the town, that the safest way to survive was to promise what was expected. "Then you'll have a bed," he replied, "and food, pay at the end of the week." It was a fairness that tasted at once like mercy and a bargain. The people of San Jacinto Viejo had opinions like barbed wire. They had already stitched together fables about why Amalia's name was whispered. Eusebio did not ask the gossiping questions. He had no appetite for the rote cruelty of small-town curiosity. He watched instead, for how she moved when no one was watching. He was practical. He liked hands that could close around a tool. He also had a way of looking at a person as if he hoped there would be something in them that could be trusted. The first week was a mosaic of small tests and unremarkable endurance. The daylight there was a work day. Hooves clucked and slipped, gates groaned, buckets chimed. Amalia rose with the chickens. She carried water, swept dust, fed animals with the economy of someone who had had to learn to keep other things from increasing the cost of living. Her work had no flourish. It had steadiness, the kind that makes a house habitable. Eusebio watched that steadiness as if it were a mapping of a landscape. He noticed the particular way her jaw set when she lifted a heavy sack, the way she paused at a certain fence post and touched the same nick with the back of her hand, perhaps an absent habit left from another place. He would stand on the other side of the yard and set his jaw against the wind and imagine what it might be like to be responsible for the person who had such deliberate quiet. That was daring for him in a way nothing else had been since his wife's death. Not to rescue, but to keep his hands available should she need them. There were people who would have called the silence between them awkward. Eusebio called it respectful space. For days they spoke in sentences short as rope. "Water's warm," he would say. "Fences sagging," she would answer. Once, when a mule balked, he barked a soft command, and she stepped in with an even softer voice, and the animal yielded. They had, in those small exchanges, discovered an economy of trust, the kind that builds houses without making promises. At night, the house settled into the slow music of country life, a kettle's low groan, the scrape of a stool, the far-off cry of coyotes. Amalia slept on a narrow bed that smelled faintly of cedar and the sun. She kept her few things in the corner: a folded shawl, a rusted tin with a few buttons, a photograph pressed between two stiff cards. She did not explain the photograph. She did not invite curiosity. No one named the thing that had happened to her. The town already did that work. Eusebio found himself thinking of the photograph in fits and starts. He had caught a glimpse of it one morning when she left the shawl on the table to chase a cow. A fragment of a face, a blurred smile, half a name on the back. He could have asked. Instead, he had folded the paper and left it where it had been. He told himself that knowledge without consent is a poor thing. He was a man who worked with timber and iron, not a man given to theft of histories. Still, the image lodged in him like a splinter, a small private thing that made noise when he lay awake. They fell into a rhythm. The days were honest and slow. The wind moved through the oak like the hands of a meditative clock. Between them, small gestures accumulated weight. A tool passed across two hands and a pause that lasted a second longer than necessary. Their fingers brushed once, twice, and the dust motes in the slanting light seemed to hang to witness it. A cup placed by her on the table. A blanket tossed over shoulders against a sudden chill. They were not declarations so much as a translation of need into attention. San Jacinto Viejo looked on in measured curiosity. Small towns are patient with outward propriety, and far worse with anything that deviates. They would watch a person like a weather vane, waiting for the slightest turn. Mothers would pull children close when Amalia passed. Men in the plaza would hold their gossip like tithes. But the mountain did not whisper. It only stood, indifferent and massive, as if it had been at the business of watching longer than any of them. There was an odd tenderness to Eusebio's watchfulness. He did not coddle. He did not flatter. He corrected a crooked fence without dramatic flourish, and he treated her like any other worker when she spilled feed in the corral. He did not, in the town's language, save her. For a man who had been held by grief and a life of duty, this neutrality was a kind of mercy. On the seventh morning, as the sun tipped back the dark and the ridgeline burned in a thin gold, Amalia hummed under her breath while she scrubbed the kitchen. The tune was old. It had edges of a lullaby. Eusebio stopped where he was mending a saddle to listen, and something in him felt like a husband in the doorway of a room he once shared with another song. He turned the saddle, smoothed a stitch, made himself useful to the leather under his hands. That day the wind came in from the valley with an early warning, a sharpness that made the birds hush and the house timbers creak. Eusebio shut the shutters he always shut, the ones that faced the western slope. Amalia kept working, but she watched the horizon with the same attentive worry that a woman watching a child would carry. The mountain often sent its moods like weather. Those moods were rarely kind. When she carried out another bucket, her sleeve caught and showed a flash of skin pale as the underside of a leaf. Eusebio caught the movement by instinct. There was a slender scar, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It ran along the inside of her wrist in a gentle arc, a line that suggested a time when hands did not know generosity. He felt an ache that was not pity and not pity's cousin. He felt the question of how to be near someone whose shape of survival had been carved by suffering. He did not ask. He made a quiet joke about the mule that made her laugh quick and bright and then look away. Laughter was a currency here that could be spent and exchanged without immediate taxes. He learned the exact pace to give her space. He learned, too, that in a small house the silence between two people could be a kind of shelter. 2 weeks into her work, the town's quiet began to wrinkle. Rumors are a kind of weather in themselves, and gossip can move with the sharpness of hail. A man who once had spoken fiercely in a cantina had a name that did not sit right with Amalia's preserved composure. Amalia Ríos, one of those names that feels like storm clouds, began to appear in the edges of stories. He had been at the periphery for years, a figure who carried the weight of a family's demands like a badge. He was Amalia's name spelled in whispered threats, the past that the town loved to brand for the present. Eusebio heard about Raphael like everyone else did, second-hand, soft-footed, public knowledge that had no owner. He did not look for stories. But words reach you when they are hurled against your fences. A neighbor came by to borrow a tool and, with a clumsy civility, mentioned that a man with a name like Ríos had been asking questions. The neighbor's eyes flicked to Amalia, and the implication landed like a pebble in a shallow pot. Amalia's face did not change, her hands kept moving, but there was a slight hitch in the way she tied a knot that afternoon, a small shuddering of breath behind the lips. Eusebio saw the movement as if he had been reading a map and found a new marking. He felt a slow, dangerous interest, an interest that would, if allowed, turn into a kind of private keeping of another person's life. He told himself that he would not pry. He had been alone for long enough to know curiosity that crosses the line is often a modest cruelty. The first real test came with the weather. The mountain makes its decisions without consultation, and sometimes those decisions are competitions between sky and stone. On an evening when the light seemed to hold its breath, the wind changed. It came in from the east with a black mouth and a taste of metal. Clouds barreled over the ridge and the animals became tense and low. The air charged and made a sound in the trees like hands rubbing. Eusebio went about his chores with a brisk economy. He tightened straps, cooed to a mare, checked nails. Every so often he looked at the sky and then at the house. He knew the shape of storms. Some of them were loud and short, others bled their warnings for hours before striking. There is a particular memorization that comes with living where weather is a maker of fate. You learn which shutters to bar and which animals to bring under the shelter of a roof. He saw Amalia watching the clouds in the same way a person watches a wound. Careful calculation and a private grimace. The rain did not begin at once. It was a conversation that escalated. The first distant crack of thunder, a flash of light like someone rummaging through a box of lamps, a gust that whipped dust from the yard into a small tornado. Then it went into business. By the time the first sheets hit the tin roof, they were in the yard chasing a loose gate. A board took off and the wind took a wagon tarp, and suddenly the ranch turned into a place where haste had to replace routine. Eusebio barked orders with an efficiency that had been forged in many storms. Amalia ran. Their movements suddenly were synchronized by necessity. They moved as if they had always been parts of the same machine. Hands that had never belonged to the same person now worked in immediate agreement. The rain built in texture, a thin sheet, then a seconds-long hammering. It spattered the porch, soaked the ground, turned dirt into a brown mussel. The wind came with a pressure that cut at the ribs. For all his carefulness, Eusebio felt the weather's insistence. The mountain had shifted, and the valley answered in sound. They got to the granary by instinct. It was a square colossus of wood and hay at the back of the property. Its doors always kept ajar for a quick pass. He threw open one side and hauled her in before the worst of the wind could drag her down the slope. The barn smelled of warm hay and animals. It smelled of spent summer. In that space, their breath fogged the cool air. The storm had made the world smaller and louder at the same time. Amalia stood a moment, her back against the wooden slats, water beading in her hair like small dark seeds. She clutched at the shawl she kept wound around her shoulders for reasons that didn't need explanation and watched him bind the heavy door. Someone else might have used the darkness of the barn to ask invasive questions. Eusebio lifted his shoulders to block the wind and then turned to look at her in the way he had been doing for weeks, with a measure of practical compassion. He handed her his jacket without dramatic flourish. It was a wool coat, a good stitch, a thing that smelled faintly of his work and tobacco and the mountain. "You'll catch your death," he said. The words were not tenderness dressed up. They were a straightforward refusal to let the night steal a life on their watch. She took it with both hands. Their fingers met in the fold where cloth yielded to thumb, and that brief touch was electric and old, like two wires finely set close enough to carry a spark. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly, and he felt it as if it were his own. He remembered how to be small in that moment. He did not press. He did not assume. He let the space be charged and safe. Lightning tore the sky with a scream that made the hay rustle. Rain hammered the metal roof in a chorus. The barn became a cavern of sound. Inside, their movements were small. He found a rough wooden crate for her to sit on, then another for himself. They did not sit close. They did not need to. The storm had already made two strangers into co-workers at survival's table. She drew the jacket tighter around her shoulders and looked at him with eyes that had been learning how not to ask. He gave her only a plain nod, as if to say, "I'm here if you need me, but not because I own your story." It was precisely that kind of restraint that began, in its slow way, to unravel the town's neat expectations. For Eusebio, the quiet kept in that barn began to sound like the beginning of a language neither had spoken aloud before. There was the faint scent of smoke in the air, not hearth smoke, but something distant, as if someone had lit a fire along the ridge to mark a direction. The sound of the rain braided into the idea of other people shouting in far-off places, words that did not cross the distance. And then unexpectedly, Amalia reached into her shawl and produced something small, a folded paper, brittle at the edges. She did not offer it, she only held it in the palm of her hand like a relic. Eusebio saw the paper and did not pry, but the thing was in his field of vision now, a private object held in a vaulted public silence. He caught a corner of script, a loop of inked handwriting that suggested intimacy. His fingers itched with the curiosity he had been guarding against. Some small part of him, the part that had never been good at letting others carry their burdens alone, wondered what the paper hid. She folded it back and tucked it deeper. The motion was guarded. The way she did it told him she had practiced the move 1,000 times in 30 different apartments or rooms. He looked away, because he had learned to respect boundaries. Yet that paper had been dropped like a stone into a pond, and the ripples were already moving outward. Outside, the storm did what storms do best. It spoke, it rearranged, it made urgent the things people were avoiding. The barn's walls seemed to breathe with each gust. Amalia's hands were wet but steady. There was a bruise blooming beneath her sleeve, pale and old-looking, like an echo of something that had come before. He saw it, and did not make a show of seeing. He noted it like one notes a sagging post, and planned to mend it in his own way. In the enveloping sound, time folded. They were two people in a world of animal and weather, and though the town's gossip crouched like a shadow waiting outside, the immediate problem required only practical minds and willing hands. He handed her a cloth and she wiped the water from her face. Their eyes met once, and in that meeting there was an admission neither spoke, that to be seen with all the carefulness of a weather-beaten man could feel like a kind of blessing. When the first crack of thunder rolled like a distant millstone, and a gust made the barn's boards sing, a noise from beyond the entrance made both turn. Something had been carried in on the wind, words, a voice shaped with urgent certainty. A farmer at the next property had his son calling to him, asking whether the road had been blocked. People shouted for help as the storm stretched itself wide. The world beyond the barn had not stopped. It had only rearranged its priorities. Eusebio stood with the jacket slack around his waist and listened to the rain as if it were a language, and he had to be fluent fast. He felt, for an instant, that took up the whole span of his chest, both the responsibility of keeping the ranch intact, and the fragile realization that sheltering someone was not the same as keeping them. He had been a man of boundaries. Protecting did not mean owning. That distinction had been made brutally clear in the silent exchange between them. He had been close to making decisions on behalf of others before, decisions that had felt like kindness but had been, in truth, presumptions. Amalia folded the paper again, smoothing it into a shape that suggested a map of old grief. She did not want to be asked for explanations. She had cultivated a vocabulary of refusal even within gratitude. When people asked the wrong questions, her answer was to look away and continue to do what needed doing. "You're all right?" he asked at last, because words were a kind of scaffolding, and he wanted to offer one. She let out a breath like a coin dropping into a well. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even. "I am." He did not speak for a long time after that. The rain took up the conversation for them. Inside the barn, the smell of wet hay and warm wool knit the two into a hush that was not intimate in the town sense, but something far older and steadier. Two people sheltering from weather together. Outside, the storm was speaking in more urgent tones now. There came another sound that did not belong to the rain, the low, irregular thump of a horse hoof against a road, a sound that carries faster than gossip and reaches a property like a warning. The hair on Eusebio's forearms prickled. He had the map of the valley in his memory, the cut in the road, the place where the ford ran wide when rain loosened the earth. He knew who rode fast when there was trouble. Amalia's eyes followed his glance. For a heartbeat she showed something like a flinch, as if a memory were a gust that could be felt and not seen. She covered it with motion, tucking the jacket more tightly, folding the paper into a safer place. "Stay here," he said, because the barn made shelter and the storm made rules. Eusebio opened the door a crack and pushed his hood over his head. He stepped into the rain with a practicality that did not dramatize but did not ignore either. The wind hit him full on and the world blurred into a painting of motion. Amalia watched him go. She had been alone in her life for long enough that the sight of someone stepping into a storm for her did not automatically mean he had fallen into something noble. She had seen men perform mercy like theatre. She had also seen the quiet, plain acts of keeping that no one noticed, but which, over time, built a kind of safety. Inside the barn, she sat on the wooden crate and felt the rhythms of the storm move her into a small solitude that was not loneliness. There was a fragile comfort in being looked after that was earned rather than bought. She unfolded the paper with a cautious hand and looked again at the face that had never been explained. The face in the photograph had the exact neutral expression of someone who had posed for a portrait in better times. It was not dressed in any local fashion. It suggested a life before the town had sharpened itself into suspicion. There was a child's hand tucked into the photograph's corner, a small pale curl of fingers, and Amalia's jaw tightened as if the memory was a wire she had to hold taut. Eusebio came back into the barn with his coat dripping and his hair plastered to his forehead. He had the look of a man who had been reminded of his own smallness. He did not make an announcement. He closed the door and latched it with a heavy practical snap. They folded themselves into a quiet that had weight now. The storm hammered at the roof and somehow made the barn feel even more contained, the world outside both noisy and unreachable. For a time the only things that occupied them were the movements of their hands, he stacking a few loose bales for the animals, she smoothing the jacket blind to the way his shoulder moved near her. They did not speak much. In the hush the barn became a small country unto itself. 2 lamps of human heat burned with a cautious intimacy that had nothing to do with romance in the way the town thought of it. It had to do instead with mutual recognition. 2 people showing each other the kind of attention that looked and felt like respect. When the storm reached the kind of sudden pitch that made the barn breathe deep, they shared a small, careful conversation that fit the space between them. "What work do you have back in town?" Eusebio asked, the question more practical than intrusive. "None," she said. "My things are there, but the house is not." He heard the absence in the words, the way a house can be a person if it has been the site of loss. He didn't say, "There are some things you have to leave." He offered instead, "You can sleep inside the house tonight." "No," she said quickly. "I'll stay here. It's safer for the animals." Her voice was as much about refusal as about making room for dignity. The barn was where the animals were. The animals had a habit of not judging. Eusebio's brows drew together in a map of concentration. He was not pleased by the thought of her sleeping in a hayloft during a storm, but he also respected the way she made choices about herself. That evening, the tension between protecting and possessing hung like a wet cloak in his mind. He had to remind himself of the difference. They ate in silence, bread warmed by the hand warmth of recent labor, cheese simple as a pact. The storm made a percussion of tin and rope and the sound of animals shifting in their stalls. Amalia told him, in the spare language of practical people, about which stalls needed mending and which fence would go for shore when the water rose. He listened and took notes with his eyes. At some point, the rain slowed to a mutable drum. The wind still argued with the oak. Lightning still sketched the valley's shape, but inside the barn, something settled. A line of understanding that no sermon could have taught. They had weathered it first as co-workers, then as people with reasons to hold the other's life lightly and carefully. When the storm thinned into a drizzle that made the metal roof sing in less insistent tones, Amalia stood and tucked the photograph back into her shawl. She smoothed her hair, and the barn smelled faintly of wet wool and the clean, raw scent of things washed to their essentials. She met Eusebio's eyes for a moment that was its own small dare. "You didn't ask," she said, and the sentence held a mixture that could have been accusation or gratitude or both. He considered the words. He was no stranger to the weight of such a silence. "I didn't know what to ask," he said, and the answer was honest without being apologetic. He had been practicing restraint all his life. He realized now that restraint can sometimes be a failure to act when action is needed, but he also knew that demands of knowledge can be theft. She nodded once and went to gather up the loose things that had blown into corners. The barn became a place of work again, sweeping, patting bales, stacking. It was a return to the economy of earning a life. When they finally left the granary, the sky had calmed into a low blue, the kind that hugs the valley after a storm and makes colors seem vivid because the dust has been beaten down. The road was a ribbon of mud and shine. They walked back toward the house under a sky that had wiped its slate clean. People were on the porch when they arrived, neighbors who had been storm-tethered and curious. There was a woman from the market who offered a cautious smile, a man who had mended fences for Eusebio years ago and nodded as if to say nothing needed to be said. The town continued its work of looking, weighing, measuring. Eusebio put the jacket back on the peg by the door. Amalia followed him inside and tidied the kitchen with a kind of careful economy. The house had its old rhythm regained, and yet something in the air had changed, not loud, but like the settling of a loaded crowbar when a lock is finally taken off. That night, sleep took them as it always does in such places, not all at once, but in pieces, in breaths that followed the pace of wind and animal, and the soft ticking of an old clock. Eusebio lay awake for a long time with the jacket folded across a chair and the paper folded in a place inside his chest. He thought of the man's name that drifted across the valley like a bad seed, Amalia Ríos. He had not yet asked the town for details. He had the patience to know that when a person kept a secret, it was often for reasons sharper than curiosity. But he had also become a man who, having glimpsed the fragility of another life, felt something akin to the moral obligation to guard it. Amalia, on her narrow bed, woke to the sound of the house breathing. She was not naive about the mountain's mercy. She knew that being sheltered by the weather or a roof does not make the world kinder. She knew the town's tongues were long and the past had teeth. She had practiced the art of returning to herself after the town had attempted to define her. She had learned to live with the balance between being seen and being safe. Their silences were now punctuated by a new thing, a recognition that both had stepped into the space where the mountain could be a witness. The mountain itself was a silent partner in the transaction, a presence that neither mediated nor judged, but only recorded. The next morning, the sun came out sharp. The yard steamed under its light like a cauldron, and the dust motes rose lazy and golden. Work resumed. The town returned to its slow gossip. But the storm had rearranged an interior where there had been suspicion now sat, awkwardly, respect. Eusebio noticed that the way she walked changed fractionally. There was a looseness in her shoulders that wasn't there before, as if the fact of having someone shelter her without asking for explanations had, if only a little, reassured a muscle that had been tensed for years. He felt the same looseness, a small relief that came with being useful without taking over. Days slipped and stitched themselves together with chores and small acts. They worked side by side on mending a fence that had been scored by the storm. At one point, their hands met on the same strand of wire, and they held it together while the post settled. Their eyes met, and they both smiled, a small private exchange that did not require the town's permission. Yet the valley kept its own rhythms. News travels fast where the roads are short and the tavern talks long. A man who had been away much of the winter had returned with questions tucked into his hat. The mention of Amalia Ríos reached Eusebio's ears again, this time with the fierceness of someone looking to settle accounts. The name carried with it the edges of judgment and the hard declaration of ownership that small towns so often mistake for moral force. Eusebio felt a tightening like a muscle reacting before a fall. There was an internal negotiation, to step forward and risk being the man who presumed to protect, or to step back and respect Amalia's agency. He had spent enough of his life at funerals and harvests and simple reckonings to know that protection can, if unconsidered, become possession. He had to decide if he would remain merely a watcher or be something more complicated, a partner in work, a keeper of boundaries, a person who could be present without making decisions for another. He began, in quiet ways, to find out what the town would tell him without being asked. He had friends at the store, men who knew how to hold a conversation without turning it into a play where everything was a declaration. He bought feed and paid with coins that had been in his pocket for weeks, and he listened to the way the shopkeeper mentioned the Ríos name as if it were a cautionary tale, a rumor with details, another with fewer. Townspeople do not often care for the truth, they care for narrative. He did not go to Raphael. He did not confront or accuse. He did something subtler. He catalogued what the town knew, and then he looked toward the thing he suspected the town had been trying to hide with its loud, soft gossip. He read the edges of the photograph he had glimpsed, remembered the child's hand, the inked name at the back that had blurred with a dampness. He paid attention to how Amalia folded her belongings. He watched her sleep lines. He watched how she flinched at sudden voices. There is a line between curiosity and the theft of another life, and Eusebio knew it existed. Yet there was also a line between negligence and cruelty. He began to lean, slowly, toward being present without making himself an answer to her. He asked himself, in a manly way that admitted to few tears, what it would mean to protect without possessing. It was a question that had no easy answer in a country that liked clear labels. For Amalia, the wind had shifted in more than the weather. The mountain being a witness meant little without people who would behave differently because of what they learned. She had been living under the town's catalogue of shame. She had been labelled in ways that were not hers. The storm had been a small crucible. It had forced two people into the same space and left them with a new vocabulary for the same chores. It had left both with a taste of what it might be to be kept in someone else's care and still remain sovereign. One afternoon, weeks after the storm, Eusebio caught sight of a man at the crossroads with his hat held low. A man who was making his way toward La Cumbre with a determination that made the horses restless. He watched the figure through the kitchen window, the man's silhouette lit by that indifferent western light. There was a familiarity to the way the man walked. There was also the possibility of trouble. Eusebio's mouth tightened like a knot. He felt a long, slow recognition. The town's past was catching up. Amalia, at her chores, sensed the dimming in the air and turned to ask if everything was all right. He saw her look in the same direction and then hold herself like a person preparing for an old argument. She stepped closer to him without thinking, not because she needed him to stand in for her, but because some part of survival is the knowledge of who will be near when the world shows its teeth. "Stay close," he said, not a command but a request that carried the gravity of someone asking to be allowed to be there. She inclined her head. She was the sort of woman who made her choices and lived with them. Standing together was a choice. They both held it lightly like the jacket that had warmed her in the barn. They walked toward the road where the man had been seen. The town, as towns do, had assembled itself like a low chorus to watch. People came forward and stood on porches, their faces a mural of curiosity and restrained zeal. The mountain watched, impassive. When the man finally appeared over the rise, he was the shade of the rumors. Amalia Ríos, no longer just a name but a person with a gait that had been well practiced in the field of making claims. He slowed when he saw the house as if a part of him had recognized a shape and hesitated at the threshold of claim. Amalia Ríos crossed the spit of road with a stride that carried purpose and old entitlement. His hat was low. His shoulders were weathered the way a stern word becomes a posture. He paused at the gate and looked up at the porch where Eusebio stood, then past him as if trying to find the woman whose life the town had been narrating for years. People on neighboring porches drew their heads in toward the scene like moths when a lamp goes on. Amalia, who had been mending a saddle strap by the back door, felt the air close around the arrival. The feeling was a familiar ache, an old alarm bell answering to a name that had once dictated how she moved. She set the strap down with a hand that did not tremble, and stepped into the yard as if she were entering a room where an old argument might be resolved. Raphael's eyes moved over the property the way someone examines a ledger. He did not smile. "Amalia," he said, and the name came out like a bill. "You have debts to settle." The sentence was less about money than about ownership. He took a step forward as if proximity could reassert history. The air itself seemed to tilt with expectation. Eusebio watched him not like a man looking for a fight, but like a man who had learned to weigh what needed stopping and what required listening. He kept his hands empty and visible, a man practicing disarmament without submitting. "What do you want here, Raphael?" Eusebio asked in a voice that could not be called loud and could not be mistaken for soft. It was the voice of someone who had learned to name obstacles plainly. The other man's jaw worked. "This is family business," Raphael said. "And this situation cannot stand. She belongs to her name or to those who can answer for it." It was the language of entitlement, the old grammar of a town that measures people against histories and ledgers. Amalia felt the air tighten in her lungs. For a second, she was a young woman again, waiting to be counted by someone else's rules. But she did not step back. She planted both feet and let the yard hold her. "You have no business here," she said, and the words were neither shrill nor pleading, only precise. She refused the script of shame. Her voice carried the trace of someone who had spent years unlearning how the town expected her to sound. Raphael looked at Eusebio as if he sought an ally in the shape of a man who knew how to keep order. "You see how she walks," he said, nodding toward Amalia with a politeness that smelled of instruction. "Either she comes with us to straighten things out, or we have—" "You will leave," Eusebio cut in. The sentence was a horse of a different nature, short, drawn, and unshakable. He stepped forward until the space between him and Raphael held only the intention of one man to keep another from working his will. "You will leave, and you will not speak for her. Her life is not something you auction in the plaza." The townspeople getting closer cast long faces and longer judgments, but Eusebio's calm held like a gatepost. He did not scream or threaten. He simply refused the premise that someone could speak in place of another human being. That refusal, in a town used to simpler transactions, was itself a kind of revolution. Raphael's mouth tightened. He had been a man who wore positions like armor. He had not often been denied. "You think you know what's best, Carranza? You take her in like she's a stray, and then you pretend to be her defender." Eusebio looked at him as if he were explaining how a fence should be mended. "I'm not pretending anything," he said. "I hire workers. I don't steal histories. If you have something to say to her, you say it to her. If you're looking for the past to drag into the present, you will find me standing here." There was a silence that seemed to tilt toward a decision. A breeze pulled at a loose corner of the tarp covering a wagon. A child somewhere began to cry. A thin, decisive sound. Raphael's face reddened with a private calculation. He had come to make a claim, but claims require neighbors who will back them. He measured the porch, the men, the way the town might lean, and decided for now to withdraw. "You have not heard the last of this," he said, which read as both threat and promise. He turned his horse and made a slow, disdainful arc out of the yard, leaving a rumble of hooves and a residue of unease. When the sound faded, the porch seemed to let out a breath it had been holding. Amalia did not move at first. She let the fact of the man's leaving settle into the wood and the dust. A part of her, old and wary, expected the town to shift back into its old stories. But something else had happened. Eusebio had said out loud that her life belonged to her. It was a small, blunt sentence that unmoored what the village had been trying to do with its gossip. "You didn't have to," she began, but stopped before the words could become gratitude. He had done something kindness adjacent, and she would not allow it to be mistaken for ownership. "I didn't have to," he agreed, "but I did." The line between the two statements sat between them like an oath neither had yet named. They returned to work, as if to let labor reordain the world. Rain had loosened the dust into the earth. The day's heat steamed the yard. But the barn had already carved a new kind of quiet into them, one that held both distance and a particular solidarity. Days went on. The town's gossip rolled, but the fact of Raphael's arrival left a mark. He was not a man easily shrugged off by a rumor. His presence demanded answers. Eusebio had, in quieter moments, begun to seek them. He did not like the idea of a life being used as a currency, of someone reduced by a single rumor. He had a practical way of caring, a restoration through work and presence, and that instinct guided him toward knowing more. He did not go to the town square to demand stories. He moved in the margins. A quiet visit to an old clerk at the registry, a question tucked into the goods he bought at the general store. He listened to the way men used the Ríos name to seal their judgments, and, like a man mapping a valley for safe passage, he charted what was true and what was the town's appetite for narrative. He found things that the town told as facts were not whole. He learned that Raphael had once been married into a line of local authority, and that he kept opinions like lit lanterns, easy to set down and harder to lift when needed. He found an old deed, a faded entry in a ledger that suggested obligations and legalities, and he kept a copy in his pocket as if it were a tool for mending rather than a weapon. He did not show this to Amalia. In private, he told himself he was protecting her from the ugliness of documentation, from courtrooms and questions asked for sport. He told himself he would reveal anything when the time came, when disclosure would help rather than wound. But protection, in the way he conceived it, included the act of deciding what knowledge to carry forward and what to leave aside. He believed he was sparing her. He believed he was softening a blow that the town, with its hunger for spectacle, might inflict with more relish. That belief became a weight in his chest he did not name. He carried it like a tool whose use he had decided alone. It was a choice whose consequence he had not fully measured. The consequence arrived in a way neither of them expected, a small thing misplaced, a ledger left open, a neighbor's careless tongue. One afternoon, a woman from the market, one of those people who thought their charity included the right to apologize for past annoyances, came by with a borrowed pail and lingered to speak with Eusebio. They exchanged a few practical words about feed and mending, and then the woman, leaning on the step with the kind of frankness that ages into presumption, said, "Heard you talk to the clerk about some papers, senor. Everyone's been asking, is she one to be saved or one to be blamed?" Eusebio felt the floor under his feet change, small and familiar but destabilizing. He answered the woman with the sort of practical calm he used for fences. "I asked a question," he said. "I learned some things." "Some things?" The woman snorted, not unkindly. "What things? That she has a child? That Rafa's been making a show? People are saying—" "Words are easy," Eusebio said, and the sentence closed the woman's mouth. But the seed had been planted. The neighbor left with her pail and a story that contained more than it had before. Amalia heard of the exchange the next morning when a boy at the market, curiosity personified, asked her if the ranch had secrets. He held his questions like fruits offered to see which would be taken. She smiled with the small economy she used for people who were not her reckoning, but that night, when she reached for the shawl at the table, she found something she did not expect, a scrap of paper tucked between the jar of nails and the ledger where Eusebio kept accounts. It was a note, folded with a care that did not match the bluntness of its content. It was addressed in Eusebio's hand, the letters clipped and practical. Records checked, claims noted. Below, in a shorthand, were names, dates, and a short clinical assessment that read like a man's attempt to turn a person's life into a tidy list. Her chest tightened with the particular ache of being catalogued without consent. The paper held the shape of some truth, facts about Raphael's past claims and references to an old affidavit that named a daughter, a custody argument made decades ago. It held also the trace of the photograph she had shown only in the barn, under circumstances of shelter and trust. Someone had written, "Child named," and a line of ink that seemed to be an assessment. She folded the paper back into the exact crease she had found it in, then folded it again and slipped it into her pocket as if it were a stone she might throw away later. That night, she could not sleep. The note sat in her like a small, heavy thing. It was not only the content that troubled her, it was the fact that the knowledge had been gathered and kept from her. He had gone behind her to find things. He had not in his quiet way decided to ask her. He had decided for her. In the morning she carried the weight like a bruise. She found him by the fence, mending a post that had been loosened by the storm. He was shirt-sleeved, sun-darkened, performing the ordinary acts that had always defined him. She watched him for a long time and then stepped up to him and handed him back the note. She did not meet his eyes. "I saw this," she said. The words did not demand an explanation. They were a report. Eusebio's hands stalled. For a moment, his face held the blankness of a man who had been struck by a weather event and had not yet found the proper way to brace. He had thought his restraint compassionate. He had thought he was guarding her. He had not gauged how secrecy could feel like a second violation. "It was for when we needed to answer," he began, and the reason came out in a voice that betrayed his interior calculation. "I thought, if I found out, I could handle it so you wouldn't have to—" "Handle it?" she said. Her voice was low, not angry but carrying the hard quality of a stone thrown for balance. "You handled me without asking." He looked at her then, and in his face there was the neat, confused ache of someone who had made a decision for another and had not anticipated the cost. "I wanted to protect you," he said. "I thought knowing would let me stop him before he did anything messy. I didn't think—" "You did not think to tell me," she finished. The sentence was a closing of a door. "You chose for me." He swallowed. I feared the town would, he began, and then he stopped, because the rest would be a litany of the ways small places wound people, and he could not make that a justification. I thought I was helping. Helping, in his language, had slipped toward control. He had mistaken the act of shielding for a license to decide which truth she should carry. For Amalia, who had learned the economy of consent by necessity, the omission was distinct and jagged. It confirmed an old truth. People who wanted to protect often did so by appropriating the right to decide. She folded herself into a thin, practical movement. She gathered a few things, her photograph tucked into its cardboard, a small bundle of clothes, and put them into a satchel she had kept under the bed. She did not throw anything. She did not need dramatic gestures. Her life fit into what she took with her. Her choices had always been measured in what she carried and what she left. I'll find another place, she said, and the declaration was not a plea. It was a practice she had been rehearsed in for years. Act, then live with the consequences. Eusebio's face went still, as if someone had turned down a lamp. For a second his mind moved through scenarios, apologies, entreaties, promises, and found them thin. He had wanted to keep things clean, tidy, protected. He had not imagined the intimate surgical cut that secrecy makes to trust. Don't go like that, he said, and the sentence was plain. Not as if I ordered you. She shouldered the satchel. This is my life, Eusebio. I decide where I lay my bag. He tried then what men in his world find hard, the utterance of responsibility without the urge to control. I was wrong, he said simply. I thought I was sparing you. I see now I made your choice invisible. I'm sorry. Her jaw softened for an instant at that. It was something, an admission, but not a repair. Repairs take time and deliberate work. Apologies are the smallest tools of mending. Amalia had learned to build walls out of apologies. She needed scaffolding. She nodded once and left with the same steady step that had brought her to the ranch. She did not run. She walked away as if she were moving through weather that required a measured pace. When the gate clicked behind her, Eusebio stood for a long time with the tool in his hand and the echo of her stride in his ears. The ranch seemed suddenly too large, a wide space of chores and silences where she had occupied a corner. He had intended to keep her safe. Instead, he had kept a part of her private history as if it were his to hold. That act, meant for sparing, had become, for her, intrusion. He had messed up the ledger where trust is counted. Amalia did not go into the town theatrically. She rented a room above the bakery, a small, inexpensive place where the light fell in a certain way and where the baker's wife minded her business. It was an anonymous refuge, the kind of place where people come and go, and nobody asks more than their coin can buy. She kept her pride like a shawl around her shoulders and did not put out any notices. She wanted a place where she could be a person who was not being assessed every morning. Word spread, of course. Small towns are efficient at carrying facts even when they are uncomfortable. Neighbors saw her on the market street buying flour. They watched her carry pails. They noted that she wore the same shawl for a week. Some thought she had no right to leave a place where someone would care for her. Others thought she had every right to be angry. The town, like weather, had its mixture of sun and rain. Eusebio, meanwhile, had a different kind of reckoning. He had expected that his apology might be the start of a repair. It had not been. He could see now that he had not only failed to consult her, he had also assumed a kind of right to the narrative of her life. The man who had always preferred wood to words found himself compelled to act in the larger space, the town square. He went to the plaza not with a speech prepared, but with a resolve to correct something that had been left crooked. He found neighbors clustered around the fountain. Gossip passed from one face to the next like bread. Raphael was there too, planted not so much in place as in expectation, thinking he had stirred the pot sufficiently. But what Eusebio did was not a spectacle, it was precision. He walked up onto the low step by the fountain and cleared his throat in the way men do when they intend their words to be practical. "This is not a man's quarrel," he said plainly. The crowd, attuned to drama, edged closer anyway. People like to see the grammar of a thing enacted. "What are you doing?" Raphael said, smiling in the manner of a man who anticipates triumph. "Putting yourself between people and their obligations." "I'm putting myself between a woman and men who make decisions for her," Eusebio replied. His voice had no flourish, it had the steady weight of someone who had learned to measure things by usefulness. Amalia Ríos is not a ledger to be balanced, she is a person. The plaza was quiet, like a held breath. In public speech often acts as a kind of law. Once something is said loud enough, the town looks to it for instruction. Eusebio set down a small fact, not to triumph, but to correct. He had looked into the records. He outlined, without melodrama, what he'd found. Dates, claims, a past that had tried to claim ownership. But he did not twist it into a spectacle. He used it as evidence against the presumption that one person can speak for another's worth. "You can speak for yourself," he said, turning his gaze toward the part of the plaza where Amalia had not come. "If you're looking for someone to make decisions, you'll find me. If you're looking for consent, you'll find it elsewhere." Raphael bristled. The plaza, which had been tasting the idea of a drama, found itself presented with an unfamiliar moral stance. A man was defending a woman's right to decide. It was simple, and for some people it landed like a rock on a weight they had been carrying. There were voices of support, small, careful people who had watched the way Amalia worked and decided that she, at least, deserved the courtesy of being her own person. There were voices that still muttered old things. But the fact of Eusebio's public declaration shifted the axis. It did not erase gossip, it only made it more difficult to wield accusation as shorthand. Amalia heard the talk in the market as she bought bread. She walked past the plaza as the crowd dispersed, hearing her name coupled with words she did not always like, but this time with the cadence of defense rather than condemnation. She did not go back. She stood for a while on the bridge that crossed the shallow river and let the water sort through her thoughts. She listened to the town speak, but she kept her own counsel. Eusebio's defense, loud and public, had not repaired the private thing that had been broken. It could not unpick the fact that he had decided for her. But it had made the town reconsider, if only for a moment, its hunger for ownership. Time became the patient craftsman of the next stage. Amalia stayed in her rented room and mended stitches both literal and metaphoric. She took to walking in the mornings beyond the town to where the ridge cut into scrub and the air smelled of cold stone. The mountain, which had watched without judgment, became her companion again. She worked at a seamstress's bench by the bakery and earned a little money while she remembered how to be with herself without a man narrating her life. Eusebio, at the ranch, did what he had always done. He worked, but his work now had a new axis, repentance shaped into action. He did not attempt grand gestures or speeches. He mended fences that led to the town, leaving them better than he had found them. He repaired a post at the bridge where Amalia walked, knowing she might see it and understand the message without a single utterance. He left food at the bakery for her without fanfare and paid for some small repairs on the room above the shop, leaving his patron's name unspoken. He wrote a note and folded it into the crack of the bridge post. A short apology and an offer to wait. But waiting is an art as much as work. It requires presence without possession. He resisted the urge to press, to follow, to demand forgiveness. Instead, he practiced the humbling task of letting her see, if she chose, the differences he was willing to make. Weeks passed. Raphael's presence in town became a rumor that carried less certainty with each retelling. Some people resumed their old songs of gossip. Others, having heard Eusebio's voice, paused when they began to speak of her with the blunt tools of shame. The mountain, patient and indifferent, wore its green like a steady face. One evening, after a day of mending, Amalia sat by the window of the bakery with a cup of tea. The light was a pale citrus that made the dust motes in the air look like slow, gilded fish. She had folded the photograph in her hand until the corners softened. The child's small fingers in the picture kept reminding her of the life she had once imagined in different terms. She felt the shape of being someone who had been defined by rumor and was now practicing the muscles of self-definition. Eusebio came by the bakery for feed. He paid, as always, with calm and coins and a nod. The baker's wife slipped him a packet for the road. He did not go into entreaties. He only paused at the doorway where she sat and looked at her with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with ownership. "You are doing well," he said, a sentence that was almost a report. She looked at him across the counter, considering whether the history between them allowed for the new grammar. "You could have told me," she said, not a question but an observation. I know, he answered. His voice was steady. I should have. I thought I was protecting you from what they might say. I was wrong. That is the problem, she said. Not just that you sought answers, it's that you took them without me. You thought you had the right to choose what knowledge I should bear. He bowed his head, letting the guilt be what it was. I know, I failed at that. I want to learn how to be better, but I won't make that demand of you. She watched him for a long time. There was a humility in his stance that had not been there before. It was not theatrical. It was the kind of change that comes from realizing one has hurt someone and choosing to spend effort altering the mechanics of habit. Can you wait? She asked at last, and the question was not a request for immediate reconciliation, but an inquiry whether his patience had become practice. I can wait, he said. I will wait as long as it takes. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She folded the photograph back into its cardboard protector and slid it into her pocket. It was not closure, it was a step. Autonomy, in the days that followed, healed in careful increments. Amalia returned to the ranch, slowly, on her terms. It was not the same as before, where earlier the silence between them had been a shelter born of mutual reservation. Now it was freighted with negotiation. They re-entered a rhythm not of possession but of chosen partnership. She came when she wanted, not because she was needed. He accepted the terms she set. They mended fence posts together, not as marks of dominance but as shared labor. Raphael's shadow did not entirely vanish. He came back into the valley for a brief moment, irritated that his sense of being owed something had not been met. He rode into the square with the air of a man used to setting things straight, but the town had shifted enough that his arrival did not exert the same force. Eusebio met him again, quietly, in the plaza. There were no blow-ups, no dramatic scenes, just a man who refused to be a mouthpiece for someone else's claim. Raphael, deprived of spectacle, retreated in the face of a community that, having seen one man stand up, was less eager to be complicit in a narrative of ownership. The full reunion, when it happened, was not a film of fireworks. It occurred one dawn after a night of clear stars and a wind that smoothed the valley. Amalia came to the ranch on her terms, carrying a small bundle and a look of someone who had weighed her options and chosen the living rock over the passing weather. She knocked on the door with the same measured hand she had used the first time she came. Eusebio answered, as he had done 2 moons ago, with the same careful lack of drama. The porch light cast the two of them in a strip of amber. He did not rush forward. He did not attempt to redeem himself with words that might sound more like bargaining chips than truth. "You're back," he said simply. "I never stopped deciding for myself," she replied. "I chose to come here. I chose it because..." She paused, finding the words she needed. "Because I liked the work, and because I liked how you stood up for me in front of men who think they own other people's stories. But I need you to understand, I come because I choose to be here, not to be kept." He nodded as if hearing a map he had to lay down on a table. "I understand," he said. "I will never forget again that deciding for you was my mistake." They moved into a life that resembled what they'd been making before the rupture, but with different axes. When the town stared, their shoulders were not in the habit of leaning toward each other like possessions. They moved with the new etiquette of consent, asking small things, hearing answers, practicing the muscle of patience. They shared a quiet breakfast sometimes, hands close on a cup, and on other days they worked in different parts of the ranch, each present without needing to own the other. A small public moment closed the arc of the town's fear. Some months later, during a festival where the valley celebrated the harvest, Amalia walked among the stalls without hiding. Children who had once been taught to look away now came to ask her about the stitches she did in tight corners. She taught one little girl how to thread a needle, her hands patient and sure. The town watched and some faces softened. It did not become perfect, old habits are stubborn, but the axis had shifted. Where gossip had reigned, respect had gained room to breathe. The mountain continued to be their silent witness. It did not approve nor disapprove, it simply observed. For Amalia and Eusebio, that quality was less about divine sanction than about the surety of place. The ridge did not sway with rumor. It held. If the mountain taught them anything, it was how to stand in weather without breaking, and how to keep one's feet when wind tried to erase footprints. Their love, if the word can be used without flattening what had been tendered slowly, was not dramatic. It was the accumulation of small acts that together created a durable thing. The way Eusebio left tools where she could find them. The way Amalia smiled a private smile when a fence stood straight. The way they argued once, then fixed the gate together, their hands meeting on the same nail. It was not an impossible love in the sense of being fantastical. It was the kind of love that a community had once called impossible because the rules it required, consent, respect, patience, were hard for a place accustomed to claiming people to accept. In the end, the discovery that changed everything was not simply that Eusebio had learned of a past that others had used as a cudgel. The discovery was deeper. He saw her as a whole person with a life separate from rumor. He discovered the dignity that refused to be auctioned. That discovery led him to act publicly, and that public act altered the town's calculus. But it also led to a private mistake. In attempting to guard what he had found, he crossed a line that required repair. The cost of his omission was real. The process of repair, admission, withholding of control, time, was resolute and patient. On a morning where the first thin light rolled over the oak and the dust motes were like slow promises, Amalia stepped out onto the porch and did something small. She set her hand on the rail beside Eusebio's, not to claim him, but to be near him as if to say, without words, "I came because I chose to." He placed his palm next to hers, the space between fingers respectful and warm. They stood like that for a long while, listening to the valley wake. The barn's boards creaked in a familiar cadence. A hawk wheeled somewhere beyond the ridge. The town below went about its business, now a little more careful with the way it told stories. Their silence had the quiet of companionship rather than the hush of secrecy. It had the steadiness of a new covenant. Respect given and respect received, choices honored, pasts acknowledged but not wielded as punishment. If anyone in San Jacinto Viejo wanted to pin a neat label on them, the label would be inadequate. They were, like the land around them, a mix of work and weather, tested, sometimes blown, sometimes repaired. What the mountain man discovered had changed everything, not by making the impossible easy, but by making the possible honest. If this story moved you, please like and share it. Subscribe for more tales about choice, respect, and how quiet courage reshapes lives.